You know what's interesting? We spend a lot of time talking about generations, boomers, millennials, Gen X. Entire books are written about how they think, how they work, and how they spend money. But there's a group that often slips through the conversation. People born roughly between 1975 and 1995. They grew up in a very unusual moment in history, right between two different worlds. Old enough to remember life before the internet, young enough to enter adulthood just as the digital economy began to take shape. They watched technology change everything, but more importantly, they watched something else happen. They watched stability become uncertain. Entire industries began to fade away. Conversations about layoffs, recessions, and financial pressure became normal background noise in many households. No one sat these kids down and explained how economic systems worked, but children don't need formal lessons to recognize patterns. They notice tone. They notice when adults seem worried, and slowly, those observations begin shaping something deeper, not just personality, but the way a person thinks about risk, safety, and money. Because when you grow up in a world where stability feels temporary, your brain starts asking a different question than previous generations did. Not, how much can I earn? But, how do I make sure things don't fall apart? And that question can quietly shape financial behavior for decades. To understand how this mindset develops, you have to imagine what everyday life felt like for many kids growing up in the late 1970s, the 1980s, and the early 1990s. Picture a normal weekday. School ends, you walk home. When you open the door, the house is quiet. Sometimes a parent arrives later, sometimes not for a few hours. You make yourself something to eat, turn on the TV, start your homework. There's no smartphone buzzing with notifications, no location tracking, no constant supervision. A large part of the day happens without anyone watching. For many kids, this wasn't unusual. It was simply how life worked. Parents were working long hours. Families were doing their best to stay afloat in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. And kids adapted. They learned independence earlier than many previous generations, just in everyday moments, figuring things out alone, solving small problems without asking for help, learning when to speak up. Over time, these small experiences create a powerful psychological pattern. You begin to understand something important. Being prepared matters. If something goes wrong, you can't always assume someone will immediately step in to fix it, so you start thinking ahead. What do I need? What might happen next? What should I plan for? But out of practicality, if you know how quickly things can become uncertain, you start valuing stability differently. And later in life, that instinct begins to show up in subtle ways, in how carefully someone saves, in how cautiously they approach risk, in how uncomfortable it feels to depend too heavily on systems that might suddenly change. Long before they ever open their first bank account, the foundations of their financial behavior are already forming, not through economics lessons, but through the everyday experience of learning, very early, how to handle the world on their own. Then, as these kids grew into teenagers, they started noticing something else. The adult world didn't seem as stable as everyone had promised. They kept hearing the same kinds of stories. Someone's father had worked at the same company for 18 years, and suddenly he was home in the middle of the afternoon, laid off. Factories closed in small towns. A store that had been part of the neighborhood for 25 years suddenly had a closing sale sign in the window. For kids watching this happen, the message was confusing. Because all through childhood, they had heard the same formula. Work hard, follow the rules, everything will work out. But reality didn't always follow that script. Sometimes the most responsible person in the room still lost their job. Sometimes families that seemed comfortable suddenly had to tighten their budgets. Vacations disappeared. Restaurants turned into cooking at home. Parents started saying things like, "We need to be careful with money for a while." Kids notice these changes. They see when the cereal brand suddenly switches. They hear more conversations about bills. And they can sense when the mood in the house becomes tense. No one is explaining economics to them, but their brain is learning something simple and practical. Income can stop, but bills don't. And that realization tends to stay with people. Years later, when this generation started earning their own money, those early observations began showing up in everyday financial decisions. You can see it in the way many of them manage their paychecks. If their monthly expenses are around $2,000, they often try to keep $10,000 to $15,000 in savings. Not invested, not touched, just sitting there. A cushion. You see it when someone earning $80,000 a year keeps driving the same car for 10 years instead of upgrading every few. Or when someone keeps doing freelance work on weekends, even after securing a stable full-time job. To an outsider, this behavior might seem overly cautious, but to them, it simply feels logical because they remember watching stability disappear almost overnight. And once you've seen that happen enough times, money stops being about impressing anyone. It becomes something much simpler, a buffer, a way to make sure that if the world suddenly changes again, and it often does, your life won't collapse with it. Let's make this more concrete. Imagine someone born in 1985. By the time they were 20 years old in 2005, they were entering adulthood in a very different economy than their parents had expected. Jobs were less predictable. Careers were changing faster, and many people their age began approaching money a little differently. Instead of spending their entire paycheck, they started saving small amounts early, maybe $200 or $300 a month at first. Nothing dramatic, just consistent. By their late 20s, they had built a modest emergency fund. By their early 30s, they began investing in retirement accounts or simple index funds, not because they were obsessed with finance, but because they understood something important. Stability rarely appears overnight. It's built slowly. Now fast forward to 2024. That same person is almost 40 years old. From the outside, they may not look particularly wealthy. They might still drive a practical car. They may not post about money online. But behind the scenes, their financial life is steady. A manageable mortgage, retirement investments growing quietly, savings that allow them to sleep at night, maybe even a second income stream. Freelance work, consulting, or a small side business built over time. Nothing flashy, just steady progress. And that's the fascinating part about financial psychology. The habits that shape your financial life often begin decades before you realize it. Small decisions, repeated quietly over many years, until eventually, those choices compound into something powerful. Stability. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoy these kinds of conversations about psychology and money, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It really helps the channel grow, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you recognize this mindset in people around you? Or maybe even in yourself? Let me know in the comments. And maybe that's the quiet paradox of this generation. From the outside, their financial lives can look cautious, sometimes even overly careful. But underneath that caution is something powerful. They learned early that stability isn't something the world guarantees. It's something you build yourself, slowly, patiently, decision by decision. And that's what this channel is about. Capital thinking. No hype, just logic.